Okay, people are beginning to roll in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our second of this round of Toolkit webinars. We'll give another minute to get people to show up, and then we'll get started. We've gotten a couple questions so far on the Shotgun Dev email list, but you guys can put in questions in the little question box within Zoom at your leisure, and afterwards we'll have time to address all of those. Yeah, I think I'll get started. Hello, my name is Tanaz Sassouni. I am a Toolkit specialist on the street team for Shotgun. I wanted to welcome you guys. Thanks for taking time out of your day, whatever time zone you happen to be in right now, to spend this hour with us. We're talking today about our new default configuration. We've had a bunch of really good changes in the last few months with Toolkit, and one of those is we've very significantly changed the structure of the default config. We are employing includes a lot more. It seems a lot cleaner. You don't have to change things in so many files. So we're going to go deep on that today. We're going to start with Rob Blau, who is our project manager, who'll give you a little bit of the why of what we've done and the reasoning behind it and how all these pieces fit together. And then we have Josh Tomlinson, who's a senior engineer who did a lot of the work and the design for the new config. He's going to go deep on the config itself and show you how it's structured. And one of the changes that came with the default 2 config is that we have a new way of handling browser integration, both under the hood and also the way that the configuration files are set up for like the right-click menus that you have inside of Shotgun for your launching DCCs, whatever. So Jeff Beeland, who's another one of our senior Toolkit engineers, he'll be talking a bit about that. And then once we've covered all of that, we'll open it up to questions so you guys can get all your questions answered. So I think that's it. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Rob.
All right, thanks, Denaz. Hi, everybody. Great to be up here with you again. So I wanted to just kind of set up the rest of the webinar a little bit and talk about why we made the change and rolled out a new default config before we go into the details of exactly what it is. So the old default config, tried and true. We've had it for a long time, and the philosophy behind it was always to kind of include the kitchen sink. Everything in it was there as an example of functionality of Toolkit. There's a whole bunch of stuff that was meant to be used in production, or at least as a starting point for production, but there was a lot of stuff there that was also just a setup, like a default directory structure. We don't know what your directory structure is going to be, but we wanted to give you a good example of what it could look like. And that's what the default config was. And then we had our big release last year that introduced the notion of being able to run Toolkit without any configuration whatsoever. So all of a sudden, if you are new to Shotgun, new to Toolkit, you download desktop, all of your projects have the ability to run our integrations. All of a sudden, a lot of the features of Toolkit, everything that wasn't explicitly dependent on knowing your directory structure became available in the tools that we have integration with. So we had the ability to auto-discover your software rather than having to go in and edit YAML files. We had a new publisher that was able to run standalone and had a whole new way of publishing that wasn't dependent on templates and, again, understanding your directory structure. And we tried to go through and think about the workflow that we could deliver, like what's the most useful thing we could deliver in that setup that was generic enough to be useful to everybody, but powerful enough that you could actually get work done. So we implemented a whole bunch of generic publishing and loading so that it was not so much the kind of work you were doing, but just the file type that you were trying to share with other people, that we were able to export load from the various tools that we integrate with. And while we were doing all of that, we needed to make some updates to the WebSocket protocol that allows the Shotgun web app to talk to the desktop. And we made some speed improvements and caching improvements. And while we were in there, we took care of a couple of requests that have been long-standing about the flexibility of what you could do within the web app. So there was lots of changes that we introduced with that whole zero configuration side. And they're cool, they're great. We did a bunch of documentation about how you could take some of that functionality, add it to a config that you were already running. Some of that was pretty intricate, hard to do. And we found that the general experience was great. You had this functionality, it worked, but you wanted to actually use work files. You wanted to have a directory structure. You wanted to use the right node in Nuke. And in order to do all of that, you had to actually have a configuration. So people would go through the setup wizard and create a configuration on disk, and they would look at it, and then, holy crap, this looks nothing like what I was running before I had a configuration. I have a completely different publisher. And my software isn't paying attention to the software entity anymore. I need to go in and configure the paths, that YAML file. And there was this big transition, and you were left in this completely new place rather than kind of the familiar workflows that you had. So we wanted to make that experience better, and that's what motivated the new configuration. So you kind of would set up your project and not be able to publish, not be able to use the publishes that you had created so far. And then for people who had been running a config, it was possible to get the new publisher up and running. We had a FAQ about that. Getting the software entities up and running was very tricky. There was a couple people who made their way through that, but it wasn't as easy as it should be. Using the new publisher logic in all of the hooks that we had was even harder. And we just wanted to make all of that stuff easier. So we'll go from no good path, either from the old world to the new world, or the new world to the old world, and carve out good paths. So introduce the new default config 2, DEFCON 2, as we've named it, and I've been talking about it. And we wanted to address all of those issues. The idea is that you could go from not having a configuration over to having DEFCON 2, and it would be a seamless transition. You would have all of the stuff you were familiar with, just with the new stuff added in. You'd have an example directory structure, your work files stuff would be there, you'd have the right nodes, all of a sudden the publishing and loading, you'd have all of the publishing and loading that you were used to before you had a configuration, but now it would actually use templates if you have them defined. It would discover things like the mantra node in Houdini or the right node in Nuke, whereas before you didn't have those, so it wouldn't. And we did new web app integration, got the flexibility of that exposed, and we restructured things while we were in there, just because the old default config, it was, the structure of it came about a long, long time ago. There's a whole bunch of changes we've made in terms of the power of includes, the reusability of various pieces of config, the ability to have sparse configs that weren't well represented in the old default config. So we kind of took a crack at lessons learned over the years and changed around the structure so that it was easier to find settings and easier to maintain overall. And that's kind of the story behind the default config 2. In order to deliver it, we made changes to the way that we do hooks in the new publisher so that it's easier to override stuff. It's easier to reuse the logic that was there. And I'm going to hand it over to Josh in order to actually go through the details of what those changes were.
Hello, everybody. Let me share my screen real quick. Can you guys see my screen? Should see my chart. So yeah, what I want to do today is just kind of, like Rob was saying, go through the structure of the new config. Hopefully you guys, if you're on this call, you've at least seen the old config, and if not, I'll show a couple peeks at it. But really, just contrast the old config, which is very flat and everything was in these sort of monolithic environment files, to the new config structure, specifically inside the environment folder, and look at what those top level environment files are now, and how hopefully it's easier for pipeline TDs and toolkit admins to go in and kind of curate their config in a much easier way than it was to do before with the old config. So I thought instead of starting at the environment file level and drilling through, it might be easier to look at it from the other way. Basically, I'll start with where we keep everything in terms of specifying what versions of bundles, apps, engines, and stuff we're using, and then work backwards up to the environment files. I think that'll hopefully make it clearer, and I'll also point out too that the link that Tanaz sent out, I think in the webinar, to this document about the new toolkit configuration, hopefully covers a lot of this as well. So if you haven't read that, this video will kind of go along with that and provide the full story. So let me get started. Let me pull up my notes here. 1 second. Okay, so if you remember in the old configuration, if you wanted to change the location of an app or an engine, for example, the Shotgun engine, every time the engine is defined, you have the location specified. Same thing with apps, that always specify the full configuration for that bundle, including the location. And that kind of made things really difficult to manage if you wanted to change the version in 1 or 2 places, but not all of them, or something like that. So one of the first things that we thought, well, it would be really nice to do is localize all of the specifications for where things live in the configuration. So we've moved everywhere we refer to a location in the new default 2 configuration into single files. So we have the app locations file, which shows us basically every app that we're using throughout the configuration, what type of descriptor we're using, whether it be App Store or local Git repo or a local file, and then the version. So everywhere it's referenced is in the configuration, it points back to this location through includes, which hopefully is useful for TDs working in studios, but it's been even very useful for us in terms of QA and just iterations internally. So I think so far that's been really good for us. Similarly, the engines file, everywhere we refer to the Houdini engine or the Nuke engine in the configuration, that all points back to this file. So if we want to change and test out some new version of the Nuke engine, we just go here, we change it in one place, and we're good to go. Likewise, the frameworks file has all the frameworks defined, all the versions of those, where they're located, and all that good stuff. The slight difference with the frameworks is that we define everything inside of this frameworks block in the YAML file, so we only have to include this one frameworks chunk of YAML, and it basically inserts this into whatever environment we're in, versus the old configuration where these frameworks were repeated over and over again in different environments. So again, that's been pretty useful. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. The second thing is this new settings folder in here under includes, which at first glance is like, well, that's a lot of stuff. Well, really what these are individual files that point to descriptions of how each of these bundles, which are the name of the file corresponds to the bundle, how each of these are used throughout the configuration. So one easy thing that I think of is if I need to change how the publisher, for example, is configured for my project, the only place I need to go to make changes to the publisher itself is in the publish configuration file. And that's different from the old configuration where you would have to go into each of the individual environment files, make changes, and it was really difficult to see what the differences were between different configurations and different setups. So The convention that we use here, we have the standalone publisher, but the convention that we use through most of these is to define this, this key at the top of each of the settings blocks that says settings, the name of the bundle, and then the engine and the environment. So if we want to have different environments for asset step or shot step within 3ds Max, you can see how those are defined here. And this thing is the key to how the new configuration works, and that this is the key that is included into, this is the key that is included into each of the environment definitions, each of the engine definitions. So the real important part is if I need to go change how the publisher works in Houdini or Maya or Nuke, I know that I can go into this one file, whether it be the publisher or launch app is another important one to know about, because it defines all the different ways we launch apps through the different engines. And you'll notice that this is much smaller now because we're using the software entity. But again, if I have an app or an engine and I want to make changes to that particular bundle's configuration, I do it through these files here. So if we look at one of the engines, for example, Maya, the thing to know about this is, again, this is only configuration for Maya itself. If it's an app, we're including that app using the include syntax like this. And again, we're using settings, bundle name, and then environment to kind of help organize how we're referring to these chunks of configuration throughout our environment files. Another thing to point out too is that if there is no configuration, if it's just a location, we tend to do this where we refer to the location directly in the engine configuration. If we're doing something more sophisticated, we'll include it this way, where we're including an actual configuration chunk. So that's important to know too. But really, the idea here is that if I need to change how an engine works, whether it be in asset or shot or wherever, I know that I just need to go to the settings file for that engine and then find that particular environment, and then I can see exactly how it's configured there. So for example, the menu favorites, location, etc. So that's kind of the key portion of the new configuration, is what's defined in these settings files. Outside of that, it's fairly similar to the old setup in terms of these top level, the structure of the configuration environment files are the same, but we have these top level files, for example, asset step, and you see they're slimmed down quite a bit. All they're doing is including each of the different bundles that they're going to make use of, and the frameworks, for example, and then they just define the engine definitions that are, that reference those engine environment configurations that we just looked at. So again, unraveling, it's if I want to make changes to an app, you go to the apps bundle settings file. If I want to make changes to an engine, you go to the engine settings bundle file. And then if you want to add an additional engine to your environment, you just add that line in here and then go through and make your changes and add your changes to the other file. So the other one I wanted to point out was software paths. So this is kind of left over from the old configuration where we had this file that defined all the different paths to all the software on the different operating systems. You can see this is stripped down quite a bit now because we have the software entity, and we're using that to drive where things are found on disk. We still have these left over because these engines don't have support for the software entity yet, but just know that that's there as well. It's analogous to the old common apps file. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was if I have, if I wanted to test, so one of the things that we do often is we want to test a different version or another version of an app, for example, published to, if we want to, if let's say, for example, you wanted to try out a new version of the publisher, one thing you could do is copy this block of configuration and say, I want to try out publisher version 10, and I might just call this, TK multi-publish to test. And so now all I'd have to do is copy this line here, go into my settings, and if I want to change this in Maya, for example, let's say I want to test this at the project level, then I can find my, or sorry, let me find the use of publisher. Let's do it at the shot step level. So I would just go in here, say, okay, for shot step in Maya, I'm going to change the publisher to use a different version of the app. So now I'm referencing, let me go here. I'm referencing publish to test, which is a different version in my Maya configuration, like this, without having to do a whole lot of work. Now I'm testing a different version of the app. So that's kind of the reasoning behind the include system, is to make it so that you can keep your locations descriptors in one place, you can keep your app configuration in one place, you keep your engine configuration in one place, and you can also compare them relative to each other without having to jump between the different environment files, those big monolithic environment files that we used before. That's kind of the basics of the structure itself in terms of default 2. We have this file. If you go to the Git repo and dive into the env, we have this Readme file that we added that provides some very specific information about how everything is structured in terms of the include keys and sort of the standards that we're using for making sure that everything is consistent in this new setup. So if you want more detailed information, or you want to see exactly how we're doing that in more detail, it's all here. In addition to that, I want to just quickly touch on the new publisher, because it is, like Rob was saying, kind of the big thing that's different in terms of functionality from publish 1 or from default to default 2, and the way that it's set up. Some of this was introduced in the basic config, if you're familiar with that, when we rolled out zero config. So, but basically we have this concept of the publish plugins, which is a new concept, which we're specifying a list of hooks that the publisher then uses as plugins to drive how individual items are collected in the publisher and then pushed downstream or acted upon at publish time. What we've done is we're relying heavily on the inheritance of hooks, and we're also using this new engine, or this engine token, to allow us to say we're going to drive these publishes not just from the hook defined in the app itself, but also we've got some functionality that is defined in the engine. So that's also something that has been around for a while in terms of that token, but we've introduced it in this config as sort of a new standard as to how we, where we define functionality that's specific to each of the engines. So that's also maybe interesting to you guys. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I don't want to take up too much time. What I'm going to do is hand it over to Jeff, and if you guys have additional questions, we can answer those afterwards. Cool?
Okay, I'll take this here. Hold up. Stand by. My presentation mode is, there we go. My presentation mode on my deck was getting in the way. So let's hop over to here. I will present. And hopefully you guys see the presentation deck now. Somebody said yes.
Yes, yep. Looks good.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit about browser integration. This is sort of a little bit tangential to the default 2 configuration, but with the release of the default 2 configuration and the changes to the structure of the config, there are some changes revolving around how the Shotgun engine and therefore browser integration works in that configuration. We also know that a lot of you are looking into switching over to using software entities instead of the paths.yaml file, even if you're not on the default 2 configuration. And with that comes a few gotchas that we'll go over here during this section of the webinar. But in addition, I just wanted to take the opportunity to give everybody an understanding of why we made the changes to the browser integration that we did, so that hopefully you have a little bit of an understanding of the reasoning behind some of the headaches that a few of you have come across as we've been transitioning over to the new RPC API that's driving the toolkit actions in the context menus inside of the web app. So let's first talk a little bit about what has actually changed, and then we'll get into the why of it. The first thing, and the one that's most obvious to you, is if you look at the default 2 configuration that Josh was just showing, we no longer have the shotgun_xxx YAML files that correspond to each entity type that we provide toolkit menu actions for inside of the web app. The other thing is that the pick environment hook is now used for browser integration. We'll go into a little more detail about why that is, why it wasn't used previously, why it is used now, and what that can be used to customize the flow a little bit. The desktop server framework is now a formal toolkit framework. That wasn't the case before. The desktop server framework is what houses all of the logic that goes into starting up the WebSocket server that Shotgun Desktop runs in the background, which is what the web app is communicating with to be able to affect changes on the local host that you're working on. And what this means is that it exposes the ability for us to provide some hook methods to you guys for customizing how browser integration works. And we'll go over each one of those hook methods that you now have access to as well. And under the hood, the browser integration, the RPC API running within the desktop server framework isn't using the tank command. And again, this is sort of a legacy approach to bootstrapping Toolkit. We now have a nice, pretty Python API for bootstrapping Toolkit, so we don't need to shell out to the tank command under the hood. And a little bit of the why there first, I think, is that if you think about the zero config Toolkit setup that we have now, there really isn't a tank command that we can shell out to in that situation. The tank command is something that is built and installed as part of a classic Toolkit configuration that is built when you run through the advanced project setup. If you think about a zero config situation, you don't have a configuration on disk that has a tank command associated with it. So on one hand, we needed to remove the dependence on the tank command when getting Toolkit actions for the browser integration, because we needed to support zero config. And the other is that it's just better practice for us to use our own API instead of shelling out to a script that then implements the functionality that we need. So it's a little bit of cleanup there. So if we move on, why did we have the Shotgun environment files to begin with? A little bit of a history lesson. And what it comes down to is the primary reason for that was simply that we needed it to run as quickly as possible. And bootstrapping Toolkit, going through the pick environment hook to figure out which environment to load, loading the huge monolithic YAML files that we had representing each environment was a very slow operation. And what we didn't want to have happen was a user to load a page in Shotgun, right-click on an entity, and have to sit there and wait and wait and wait for all of that processing to happen before you end up getting a list of actions that you can then take. So the approach was to bypass as much of the logic in core for bootstrapping Toolkit as possible and only do the bare minimum necessary to be able to get an environment, get the commands for the Shotgun engine from that environment, and present them to the user in the menu inside of the web app. And so what you see are very simple YAML files with only the Shotgun engine defined, so there's very little actual YAML to deal with reading off of disk and parsing. And we had a custom sort of code path that was used to bootstrap into these Shotgun YAML file environments that sort of bypassed a lot of the logic that would typically be used when launching Maya and bootstrapping Toolkit, as an example. And the other was that it gave an easy way to expand what entity types supported browser integration, or where we provided toolkit actions in the context menu for given entity types. As an example, you could drop a shotgun_playlist.yaml file, configure the shotgun engine with a set of apps that you wanted to show up when you right-click on a playlist entity inside of shotgun, and magically, the next time you go to the web app, refresh the page and right-click, you would get those actions for the playlist entity. So it was, in that regard, an easy way to customize the browser integration for use with any entity type that you could come up with, even custom entities in a lot of cases for some of you guys. And then the question becomes, why are we not continuing to use those shotgun environment files? One is simply, again, we have a custom code path that bypasses a lot of the core API's bootstrap logic. And that both means we have divergent code paths that we have to support in QA. There's more logic to contend with, and there's a lot of specialized logic around dealing with these shotgun environment files. Whereas we would rather have one code stack that serves the purpose of providing toolkit functionality across the board, whether you're talking about browser integration, shotgun desktop, whether you're in Maya, Houdini, or whatever. So it's a good cleanup exercise for us, get back to having one API that provides all the functionality that we need. And also the fact that it bypasses the pick environment hook actually limits what we can do with browser integration. A great example of where pick environment would help that the shotgun environment files don't allow for is the ability to have different toolkit actions show up for tasks linked to an asset versus tasks linked to a shot. With the shotgun environment files, we have shotgun_task.yaml. Every single task that you right-click on, regardless of what it is linked to, bootstraps into the shotgun_task environment and gets the same list of commands. That means you can't have two different sets of apps depending on what a task is linked to. And in the case of using a pick environment, you have some Python logic there that we'll take a look at next, I believe, that allows you to do more complex operations when determining which environment you're going to bootstrap into. So based on the context that comes in, a good example here is at the top here, lines 25 to 27, you see that we're checking the source entity of the context to see if it's a version or a published file. And we route ourselves to a custom published file_version environment that we want to load YAML from, get commands from, and present when version or published file entities are right-clicked on. In addition, we gain the ability to split shot step and asset step, which is what I was just talking about with task entities linked to one or the other of those things. So now the shotgun engine can be configured differently in shot step YAML than it is in asset step.yaml. And all of that you sort of get out of the box because we already have that functionality baked into the pick environment hook that we provide with the default configuration. So it does provide more flexibility. It's obviously going to be a little more complicated. You do have to go into the pick environment hook and add support for new entity types if you're doing that, as opposed to just dropping a new YAML file, shotgun_playlist.yaml. So there's a little bit more work, but there's a great deal more flexibility in which environment you pick for which entity types. So those of you who are keen to build highly custom workflows, and we know there are a lot of you guys out there, you now have more options as far as how browser integration works. And then I mentioned that the desktop server framework is now a first-class citizen in Toolkit. It is an actual Toolkit framework, just like Shotgun Utils or Qt widgets or any of the other frameworks that we provide. And what that means is it's a normal bundle, and bundles in Toolkit can have what we call hooks. You guys, any of you who have used the Publish app or most any of our apps have dealt with hooks before. And the desktop server framework now provides a browser integration hook that has 3 hook methods inside of it that allow you to customize some of the flow of how browser integration works when Shotgun, the web app, requests actions for a given entity. Those 3 hook methods are get cache key. We'll talk a little bit about what the cache actually looks like under the hood as we get towards the end of this presentation. But needless to say, there's an SQLite cache that sits underneath all of this where if the configuration hasn't changed and software entities haven't changed inside of Shotgun, we know that we can return cache data. Each one of those cache entries has a key, some way to look it up based on the configuration that's being used for the project. And we provide a default implementation, but that can be taken over if you want to do probably highly advanced manipulation of the browser integration. We also have a method to get the site state data. And what this allows you to do is help determine or customize what determines invalidation of cache entries. So out of the box, what we do is we look at YAML file mod times on disk for the configuration. If you're talking about a classic toolkit configuration where you've run through the advanced project setup. And we also look at the software entities inside of Shotgun because we need to know, did the product change or did version restrictions change or did you add software entities? Any of that type of change inside of Shotgun to the software entities is going to impact what launchers are available, whether it's Maya, Houdini, or Flame, Flare, whatever it might be. And so we know that we can't rely on the cache data. What the get site state data hook method allows you to do is add additional conditions on top of that. So if there is additional work you want to do to help determine whether the cache entry is valid or not, or whether it should be dumped and regenerated, you have the ability to customize that behavior. And the last and probably the most useful, I would say, anybody who's getting into this, into customizing browser integration is probably going to be most interested in the process commands hook method. What this does is after all of the toolkit commands that are going to be returned to the web app to be shown inside of the action menu, but before it's actually sent, is filtered through this process commands method. And what you can do is you can manipulate that data structure in any way you want to. You can add entries to it. You can filter things out that you know you don't want to show up for certain users or in certain situations or on certain shots, that type of thing. You can do that in any way you manipulate that data structure and then return it back to the server itself will reflect in the browser when the user shows that menu. So it's what we're trying to do is out of the box, this should work, but we understand that some of you guys have a great deal of customization in your pipelines, and we wanted to give you more places where you could customize behavior. And traditionally, browser integration hasn't been something that's been particularly easy to customize. And so we're trying to give you guys a few places where you can inject your own take on how this should work given your workflow requirements. Now we'll talk a little bit about backwards compatibility, which is that it should be, but there are some gotchas. And then debugging and some of the common problems we've seen come in through the support channel after we've released this stuff. So backwards compatibility, this should be backwards compatible all the way to 0.15. something TK core. We go back quite a long way. Anything that we consider a modern core, which is partway through the 0.15 era of TK core. We still support the shotgun underscore entity type .yaml files, but there is a gotcha related to that, which is that we always try to bootstrap through pick environment, going to the hero environment files first. We only fall back to the shotgun environment files if that first bootstrap attempt fails. What this means is if you have TK shotgun configured, an instance of TK shotgun, in your environment files, it will be used, even if you have a shotgun underscore task.yaml file. We've had a handful of support tickets come in where at some point in the history of their config, somebody dropped in a TK shotgun instance inside of asset step, as an example. And then all of a sudden we release this new desktop server with all of this new functionality, and they stop seeing any toolkit actions inside of Shotgun for tasks linked to assets. That's an unfortunate situation, and it's not immediately obvious why that's the case because there were no errors. They just happened to successfully bootstrap into asset step. The Shotgun instance, the TK Shotgun engine instance, didn't have any commands configured, any apps configured for it, and so they got no actions. So first and foremost, If you're planning to continue to use the shotgun environment files, which is fine, we know that there will be a transition period. A lot of you, or probably all of you, have your configurations that you've used for a very long time now, and it'll take time to transition to a new structure. Just be aware that you need to make sure that you don't have an errant shotgun engine configured somewhere in the hero environment files that are used by pick environment. And the other thing is that the caching mechanism has changed. Previously, when the tank command was used to get toolkit actions, it had its own caching mechanism, basically a bunch of text files that stored a bunch of text data, where each line of the text file, the cache file that it was built, was a command delimited by ampersand symbols or @ symbols. Can't remember which, and it would split, and that would give it all of the settings and all of the information it needed to be able to tell the web app what the command was to add to the toolkit menu. Now, like I said, we've switched to using an SQLite cache. It gives us a lot more flexibility. It's faster. A database is what this is the correct storage mechanism for this type of data. But what that means is when this change went out, the first time somebody loaded up a shotgun page and showed the menu, it might be quite slow, especially if your configuration is stored on network storage that might not be the fastest thing in the world. Say you're on a Windows network Samba mounting a file system that's running on a Linux server or something like that. It can be quite slow because there's a lot of data to read the first time when there's a complete cache miss. So it just helps to know that when this happened, we understand that it was slow. After the cache has been populated, it's actually a good bit faster than the old tank command method of getting the toolkit action. So you take a hit up front, the cache keeps itself up to date, and everything should be fast after that initial cache hit. Some other common mistakes that we've seen come in. Probably the one that is the most complicated to work out is the transition from using paths.yaml and app launchers with Launch App over to software entities. Now, that's particularly troublesome for a lot of people because when using software entity launchers with Launch App requires access to every engine that you want to have launchers for. That means for Launch App to be able to find what Houdini versions you have installed on your machine, it needs access to the TK Houdini engine because that's where the logic is to scan your system and find Houdini installs. Traditionally, the shotgun _xxx YAML files have only had a configuration for the TK shotgun engine, which means you don't have access to TK Houdini, TK Nuke, TK Maya, all of these different engines that contain scanning logic for finding the software that's installed on your system. So if you just took your existing shotgun _task.yaml file, switched over to using Launch App with use software entities set to true inside of the configuration for the app, you wouldn't get any launchers. So, and again, it wasn't an error case, right? As far as the shotgun engine is concerned, it was able to bootstrap, it was able to start the Launch App. The app wasn't able to find any software installed on your machine because it didn't have access to the scanning logic. And so no launchers were returned to the web app to present to the user inside of the toolkit action menu. So that's something to keep in mind. You certainly can use software launchers with the shotgun environment files, but what you need to know is that you need to include the engine instances for all of the engines that provide scanning logic, Nuke, Maya, Houdini, and the like, inside of that shotgun YAML file. And what that'll do is it'll make sure that Launch App has all of the code that it needs to find the installed software on your machine. And at that point, you should see the cache being rebuilt because the mod time on the shotgun YAML file changes. Browser integration, the RPC API knows that it needs to invalidate the cache. It rebootstraps. Launch App then has access to all of the engine instances that it needs. It gets all of the launcher commands and it returns those back up to the web app. All right. The second item on the list is exactly what I was talking about in the previous slide, which is that we bootstrap in using pick environment, going through to the hero environment files first, and only fall back on the shotgun YAML files if that bootstrap fails. So if you have an instance of TK Shotgun living in an inherent environment file like project.yaml, it'll be used. So that's a fundamental change from what you used to get, where we used to just go straight to the Shotgun environment file. So keep that in mind. And the third item is that the tank clear shotgun menu cache command, which is something that's probably pretty commonly used amongst TDs and admins of Toolkit, doesn't clear the new cache. And the reason for that is the cache is now global to the site and not specific to the project. When the tank command was being used to get commands for browser integration in the previous implementation of the RPC API, the desktop server uses, everything was per project. So the caches were built and baked into the config that was installed that was set up for that project. Now everything is stored in a single SQLite cache for your site. And as an example, at sort of the Shotgun home root here, underneath your site name, you have a site.basic.desktop. The TK desktop engine is where the desktop server is running, so that's why the cache lives under that engine's cache area. And then there's a single file in there that's the SQLite database file for Shotgun engine commands. So instead of running clear Shotgun menu cache and having it blow away an entire site's worth of cache data, if you want to nuke it, you can go in there. It's totally safe to remove the SQLite cache. It is local to the user's current host, meaning you're not going to affect more than just the person using that machine. And if the SQLite cache is deleted, all you have to do is refresh the page inside of Shotgun, show the menu again, and it'll be regenerated. You'll just have to take the hit of the complete cache miss, having to bootstrap, get all of the commands, repopulate the cache. But if you have a problem where you think something is broken and you're getting back broken cache data, just like before where you would run clear Shotgun menu cache as an attempt to see if it would just clear itself up after doing that and refreshing the page, you can nuke the SQLite file pretty safely and then refresh the page just like you would have before, and you should be in good state. That pretty much covers the high points that I wanted to hit here. I know that there's a lot more going on under the hood that I could go over. We'll keep it to this. If you guys have specific questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. You all know how to get a hold of us. We're happy to talk about it. I've spent a lot of time with a few of you already going over this and debugging a couple of regressions that we did have after the initial release several months ago. And then again, a couple of problems that came up with the more recent changes that we've made as part of the default 2 configuration going out. So I'm perfectly happy to continue doing that. I'll give you as much detail as you want, and we're happy to help debug as well. So with that, I will pass it back to Tanaz, if I can stop my screen.
All right. Excuse me. All right. Thanks, guys. We are now opening it up to questions. We have a bunch that we've received already, and we've answered. We've given like text answers to people, but I kind of wanted to go over those with all of you guys so you can all share that information. Actually, before I do that, we actually had a couple questions come in on the Shotgun dev list, so we can look at those first. And if you're not familiar with the Shotgun dev list, what I'm talking about is it's a Google group that is sort of for technical users of Shotgun. We have a lot of Toolkit inclined folks on there. We have our engineers often chime in. So I encourage you to join that group if you're not already on there. It's shotgun-dev is the name, and it's a standard Google group. The first one we got was just what makes the new config stand apart from the old config such that the need for a new config arises. I think that this whole webinar answered that one, so I think we can go on to the next. We had a question, are there any potential gotchas if we try to implement a sequence level workspace? Anything particular that we should keep in mind after adopting the new config and moving to sequence level? So I don't know if anyone wants to.
There's nothing, no gotchas. The patterns that are there, you just kind of stamp out for the sequence level. You just have to make sure you set up the templates and the schema so that you've got the place to work. If you have settings that are specific to the sequence level, you just follow the pattern that Josh showed. for dropping down that set of config into the appropriate app or engine or framework YAML file, and then reference that instead of the the SHA-1 or whatever you're stamping out from. But no gotchas.
Okay, moving on. Someone asked, is there any chance you'll provide an episodic config? The general answer is, the specific answer to that question is that we have this default config as a starting point. We have documentation on like directory structure, hooks, templates, changing it, kind of adding a sequence, adding episodic, whatever, but there isn't a specific episodic config that we are providing. And that also kind of turns to something else, which is we've in the past had a games config and a multi-root config. At this point, those have been deprecated. We have a single default config, as well as, again, step-by-step documents that can talk you through converting those if you have multiple places, multiple locations where you're storing files for your production. You can use multi-root. If you're using Perforce and you want to integrate it in, there's a document for that. So that's something to keep in mind. And of course, if you have questions going through that process, we can help you out. Next question, do the tank commands, tank updates, and cache apps still work? The answer is yes, it's all the same. Somebody asked, is there any tool available to help us migrate the current config from the old default structure to the DEF CON 2 organization? We don't have a tool for that because everyone's config is different, and I don't think it would make sense to have one way of doing it. But in that document that I added the link to in the chat towards the beginning of the hour, there is a section called Migrating Existing Configuration that, again, walks you through that process step by step. It's definitely like tread carefully, know what you're doing when you're making that conversion, but it can be done. What else? Can we access the slides after the webinar? We'll send out a recording and we can definitely provide you guys access to the slides as well. And then we have a couple others. There's one here. Is there any plan for the third-party-ish Katana engine? Doesn't seem to work with Toolkit anymore. Any plan to make it official? Rob?
So there's nothing on the roadmap now to make that official. We are trying to make sure that it's easier to use third-party engines that people are sharing in Toolkit. I wrote a note. We're trying to make sure that in terms of all the host app-specific logic, we're moving it from multi-apps. So it used to be like the publisher, the launcher, all that stuff had the app-specific logic in the repo. The host app-specific logic. So there's knowledge about launching Maya that was in the launcher. And we've been moving that over to the engine repos themselves so that introducing a new engine could be a very self-contained thing. You didn't have to branch any of our multi-apps in order to kind of maintain the pattern that's been established. So we're hopeful that it's easier to use it when it gets in shape, but we don't currently have plans to actually go in and refresh the Katana engine that is out there. We're definitely game if there is some Katana TD that's more familiar with the workflows than we are, who is going in and do that. We can definitely help provide any kind of toolkit knowledge and code reviews, whatever is needed in order to help get that in shape. But we don't have anything scheduled to do that ourselves.
Cool. The last question we have is a little off topic, but the question was, my users really like the review tools. Right now, they're heavily using Screening Room. No one has used RV yet. Can you give us an idea of what changes are coming to the review tools in the future?
I can take that one too. So in terms of the Shotgun roadmap, we are planning on having a kind of artist and supervisor specific desktop app. There's been a couple of presentations that we've done since SIGGRAPH last year, talking about it. There should be recordings available. If people are interested, then get in touch with us. We can make sure that you can kind of get access to the recording of our last roadmap presentation if you weren't able to make it. And that is a desktop app that uses the RV display technology, but is completely geared around review and kind of task management. So you can, as an artist, know all the tasks you've got to work on, jump in it, see the details, and then have a rich way of submitting stuff for review and getting the review back, all kind of taking the review setup in Shotgun and making it better. So there's a big investment in that front. It's not necessarily RV specific, although it plays nicely with RV. And it's not updates to the web app, but it is a new desktop app that will be coming out sometime in the nearest future. Exact dates or timeline you can look at the roadmap presentation for. In terms of RV itself, we do have both the SG review and screening room sets of integrations for RV. We have made a decision to focus on the screening room, so the older integration that we have, and we are queuing up work in order to add some of the features that were only in SG review into screening room so that people can continue using that. So things like being able to play back a cut is the big one. Having that set of functionality be cut aware. And that's the current story around review. If you want access to those recordings, just get in touch with me, Rob at shotgunsoftware.com, or go through support at shotgunsoftware.com, and we'll make sure you get it.
Great. We had one more question that just came in. Not completely familiar with Toolkit, so the docs may answer this already, but here goes. Similar to app configs, is it possible to define configs for specific output file types? For example, publish from any app, always generate data in a specific root location, and if generating a limbic from any application, it should always be output in a specific directory structure. Same for EXR, VDB, etc.
I can definitely handle that, but anyone else want to jump in? Everyone's probably tired of hearing my voice.
Yeah, I'll answer it. Might as well. Yeah, Toolkit has a system for building file path templates. And the publish app, when used with the default 2 configuration that Josh was going over, makes use of those templates, which defines where data is written to when you publish out of, say, Maya, an Alembic file. Say you have complete control over the file system structure, both of the project and where data is written to. And you can configure that however makes sense for your studio, for your team to work.
Wonderful. I hope that clears that up. If you have deeper questions about that, feel free to contact support, because that's like kind of a rudimentary Toolkit concept, so we can talk you through that. That is the last question we had, and we have about 2 minutes to go. I don't know if you guys on the panel have anything else to add? Doesn't sound like it. Okay, we are recording this, so we'll send out a link to the recording, as well as access to the slides and some links that are relevant from our documentation here. I sent him out to the Shotgun Dev list with the announcement of the webinar, but we can send him out again. I hope this was useful for you guys, and we're always interested in hearing if you have things that you would like subsequent webinars to be about, things you would like us to cover. So we'd love to hear that feedback, and we'll keep you posted on when the next one will be. Thanks a lot for hanging out with us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheerio.